Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It's 1945. The world's superpowers, meeting in a town on the south coast of the Crimean Peninsula, draw lines on a map, carving up post-war Europe, carving out Soviet spheres of influence. Their decisions yielded long-term consequences for countries that had no possible say. 80 years later, echoes of the Yalta Summit loom over Alaska, where today, President Donald Trump will meet with Russia's Vladimir Putin to discuss the fate of an unprovoked war he started in a country that will not be represented at those talks. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Elizabeth Wood, Russian specialist and professor of history at MIT, about what's at stake as two major powers attempt to take the first steps to end the war in Ukraine without Ukraine. Professor Wood, such a pleasure to be speaking with you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
I want to start with the significance of holding the summit in Alaska, because the gesture of an American president hosting a historical adversary on U.S. soil at a U.S. airbase, nonetheless, it feels very much like this favors Putin.
It's also very strange for it to be called a summit. Typically, a summit is arranged for months in advance. There's a detailed agenda. They know what they're going to talk about. They have advisors. They have note takers. They have translators. It's a very, very big deal. And Putin has been angling for a summit with Trump for a long time. But Trump, following Biden's footsteps, has said this is a country that has invaded a sovereign state in the 21st century. It's the largest war in Europe since World War II. So it's a very, very big deal for the United States to be recognizing Vladimir Putin on U.S. soil. The choice of Anchorage is interesting. I think, my guess is that it's halfway between Moscow and Washington, D.C., but I also think it plays a role that the International Criminal Court has a warrant out for Putin's arrest. Ironically, the one country he can go to without fear of that actually being fulfilled is the United States, because the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC. So I think the Anchorage has a lot of significance. One more thing is that the Russians are making a big deal of it because they sold Alaska to the United States for $7 million in 1867. So somehow this is about borders being retaken. Since the taking of Crimea, there have definitely been memes and popular sayings, oh, we'll take Alaska next. Obviously, that is not what Donald Trump is going to do. But, and I'm sorry, I should let you ask the questions, but it is interesting that it's up in the Arctic, which is a region both presidents are interested in. And it's possible that the real deal here is not about Ukraine, sadly, but about other matters, which we don't even know.
Mm-hmm. I do want to pick up on that point because, to your point, like usually there would be extensive debate over the agenda, a whole bunch of things happening before this meeting, but we're really heading into it with very few advanced expectations about how this will all go down. Trump himself is kind of framing this as like a feel-out session to take measure of Putin. And I'm just wondering how you might see this playing out.
Well, I think that too is very strange, even for a deal maker. He's an avowed deal maker. A deal maker goes into a deal knowing what they want and knowing what they don't want. For him to say repeatedly in his August 11th press conference, well, I'll wait and see. I'll hear what he has to say. I'll know whether I want to take it or not. That is reactive rather than proactive. And of course, the biggest problem of all is that Vladimir Zelensky, president of sovereign Ukraine, the largest country in Europe, won't be at the table. And the Europeans, to their credit, are having other meetings, are trying to line up what should be the minimum discussion topics. But Trump is playing his cards very close to his chest if he actually has some. I mean, to some extent, the wait and see what Vladimir Putin says is kind of really not the behavior of a first world leader who trying to broker an extremely complicated war.
Yeah. What is the goal for Trump here? Is the aim to show that he's the one who continues to play a big role in the situation in Ukraine, that, he's the only person capable of talking to Putin? I just wonder what his aims are going into this.
I don't think anybody really knows. My my reading of this is that he's particularly proud of his relationship with Putin. This goes back, some people think, to the 80s. It's entirely possible that there's a very, very old relationship there. So both of them, this is one of the ironies and saddest tragedies of this whole war. Both of them are playing primarily to each other personally. And that is awful. That, tens of thousands of people have died, civilians have died, soldiers have died, and especially civilians in Ukraine, in playgrounds, in schools, in hospitals, because these two men are playing out an ego game that they think represents their countries. And there are Russians, there are Americans who believe in this kind of one man, showman. It's, in a way, it's like sports. He's our guy. And so we look for the guy who's going to represent us and tell us what to think and how to react. So that Putin and Trump playing to each other is really absurd. And I honestly keep worrying that they have entirely other agendas, that Putin will try to avoid the topic of the war and Trump will let him because Trump is interested in other real estate. From the August 11th press conference, it's clear he's gotten real estate on the brain. He referred to Ukraine as having oceanfront property. People have commented on that because it's the Black Sea. It's not an ocean. I don't care. It's waterfront property, but it's not property that's uninhabited. Millions of people. Ukraine has a population of 40 million people. There are 3 million people in the occupied territories. So to talk about swapping territories as if no one is there, it's not human. It's not conscionable to not think about what is the cost to those who've died, to those who are dying, to those who are at the front lines, and to those who are living under Russian occupation, which is really brutal. Anyone who speaks up against them ends up in one of these filtration camps. There's ample evidence of torture behind Russian lines.
So you do think there is credibility to the concerns that Trump here is probably more interested in kind of broader American geostrategic interests rather than securing peace in Ukraine?
The one place I would disagree is I think broader strategic American interests are to end the war in Ukraine, to prove the rule of law, to prove the rule of international law, including the International Criminal Court. So it's like taking in Pinochet or, countless number of dictators who have taken Hitler to the United States. So I don't think it's in U.S. interests. I don't think any offshore deals that he creates can remotely live up to the instability that comes from allowing this kind of war to go on, to have allowed it in the first place. I mean, he made this awful comment about what has Vladimir Zelensky been doing for the last 3.5 years. He's been fighting a war every day. He's been getting bad news. I don't think the man has taken a vacation. I hope he has. I don't know. But the point is that Trump has been playing golf and doing his thing. So I think it's very important to establish that really this is not in U.S. interest. However Trump may spin it, my feeling is that it's not in U.S. or North American interests. I mean, I am thinking here of the Canadian perspective that, Canada has a great deal of interest in and work on the Arctic. And if they were talking about demilitarizing the Arctic, I would be in heaven. Canada has tried very hard to hold the line on that with, Russia building more and more bases in the Arctic, planting flags on the North Seas. It's really quite dangerous moment there too.
I do want to ask you about the stakes for Canada and for other countries who are part of this, coalition of the willing in just a moment. But as you rightly mentioned earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will not be present at that table. Trump has acknowledged that the idea of exchanging land for peace is under discussion, will be under discussion. Just how real is the possibility that Ukraine could be strong-armed into concessions after this meeting?
This is the most delicate subject. And I think we need more discussions with Ukrainian people, what they're willing to tolerate, what they need, what they want. The truth of the matter is, all the reports I'm hearing from friends and colleagues in Ukraine is they're exhausted. It's absolutely brutal. Everyone has lost loved ones. And so the question is whether there are 5 territories under discussion, right? There's the original Donetsk and Luhansk that Putin tried to start taking in 2014. And we have evidence that he was involved from the very beginning. Then Kherson and Zaporizhia and Crimea. My guess is that Trump is thinking that somehow they would try to get back Kherson and Zaporizhia for Ukraine. Maybe Russia would get the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk they've flattened and, really pretty much destroyed. I don't know what they would do about Crimea, because as long as Russia has Crimea, it can attack Ukraine very easily. So that will be the really, really hard one. Only the Ukrainians can say whether they're willing to countenance trading some of their own territory for peace and security. The security guarantees would have to be ironclad as much as that is possible. So I think, given that Russia has reneged on treaties from 1991, 1994, 1997, specialists, I could tell you more if you wanted. It doesn't matter. But the point is, these were treaties signed between sovereign countries and with sovereign territory. The Ukrainian borders, as they are, were founded by a negotiation back in 1922, when the Russians decided, okay, Donetsk and Luhansk and that Donbass region should be part of Ukrainian Soviet Federated Republic. And 1991, they agreed on those borders. 1994, they agreed to disarm and keep those borders. 1997 was a peace treaty on those borders. So those borders have been internationally recognized since the 20s, and certainly since 1991. So only the Ukrainians can say whether they, in kind of a state of exhaustion, are willing to say, all right, we'll give up those parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that the Russians have already taken, but we have to have Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea back. I don't know. Unless we hear from Zelensky, unless we have him at the table.
On the issue of Russia looking to cement its territorial gains, and again, returning to the symbolism of this all being held in Alaska, where, as you point out, this was land that was once part of the Russian Empire, as the site of talks about Ukraine. Do you imagine Putin is going to make the point that, look, borders can change, land can be bought and sold?
And you've just said the most important part of that sentence. It can be bought and sold. It can be agreed on. I think that's in Russia. That's the way it's playing. That we had Alaska. Now you have Alaska. They have Eastern Ukraine. Now we'll have Eastern Ukraine. That's not the same thing. Russia has, and in fact, Trump said one true thing, I feel, in his August 11th press conference. He said, he quoted Viktor Orban to say that Russia has won by conquest. And I think that is true. I do the whole gamut of Russian and Ukrainian and Soviet history. Going quite far back, Russia has always gained territory through conquest because it's difficult to make treaties that last and because they have a difficult time innovating in their economy. So you take the more successful economy by force. And that's what happened after 1945. That's why they ended up with East Germany. That's why they ended up with Poland and Czech Republic, all of which were somewhat more advanced than the Russian Republic. It depends on the area you're talking about, the industry, etc. But that you take the territory so that you can have that benefit.
Do you see a reality in the near future where Ukraine accepts concessions or makes concessions?
I think if they really have the European support, I think if he were to go into this with the entire support of the European Commission, the European powers, and Ukraine, then Putin could be brought to the table to make a peace. But without that, going alone, Trump doesn't have any power over the Russians. He hasn't. Deadline after deadline has passed, and he hasn't brought in more sanctions.
Yeah, put a fine point on it for us, beyond obviously the very critical implications for Ukraine. What's at stake here for European allies and Canada?
For European allies, there's a deep insecurity. I have close colleagues in all the Baltic states, and the thing I've heard, I believe it was the Estonian president say, even if Ukraine agrees to concessions, we don't want to support that. We don't want there to be concessions because the Baltic states in particular could be the next bargaining chip Russia invades and everybody says, oh, we don't want to go to war. That's
it's a domino effect.
It's concerning for Poland. It's concerning for the Czechs and Slovaks. It's concerning for all the neighbors. And it's significant that Russia has had overlordship over most of Eastern Europe at one point or another. And aside from Orban in Hungary, none of them consider Russia a reliable or a desirable close partner. So that's a big concern. The other concern that affects both Europe and potentially Canada is appeasement in 1938 in the war, and Canadians know their history better than Americans do, led to full-scale war. That's the last thing we want. We don't want World War III. We don't, Trump makes noises and Putin makes noises that if we don't solve this war, it'll end up in World War III. It'll end up there more likely if there's appeasement than if there isn't. It's just too fraught to force sovereign, especially a very large and very successful and very innovative democracy that's had 6 presidents in the last 30 years compared to 2 presidents that Russia's had. They have proven that democracy works, innovation works. They just went on the streets to protest around corruption last week. So I think that seeing Canada as a worthy ally, see Ukraine as a worthy ally, is very important for all of the powers of Europe and the Canadians and the North, all the North Americans. So we'll see. Their high stakes are high here.
I imagine, though, like Putin is very pleased with the conditions heading into this meeting because, I mean, the U.S. and its allies long sought to make him a pariah over his war against Ukraine. But now Trump is, willing to meet with him, take on this meeting without any preconditions. It almost kind of feels like maybe the beginning of a restoration of Putin's position in the world. Am I overstating that?
No, that's certainly what Trump wants. I don't think that's what's going to happen with Europe, but I definitely think that's what Trump wants and certainly what Putin wants. Putin's had a whole slew of bad reports that have been public about the economy in Russia. He's got, ministers who would love this war to end, but nobody can say anything unless he agrees. So as long as Putin is making some kind of progress, Russians will accept that because the big enemy and the big power to admire has been the U.S. and I would say Canada too, since 1917. That's who they look to as their ultimate rival and model. I mean, they're closer to Europe. They send their kids to Europe. The kids are educated there. But I think this idea that the U.S. accepts Putin means a lot to them. It doesn't end the war, though. That's the problem. And so at some point, Putin is going to have a reckoning with his own advisors and with his own people. We've got reports now of serial widows women who marry over and over again to get the benefits for the soldiers. But the demographics are just horrendous. And that cannot be good for the Russian economy. And they've also got debt within the military and the banks, so that the banks are trying to hold the economy together, even as the military is spending beyond what it has. So it's a very complicated, delicate balance.
What do you see as Trump and then separately Putin viewing as a success leaving this meeting? Like, what may they both be satisfied with coming out of it?
Well, the ultimate success for Putin, of course, would be if Trump goes to Zelensky and says, you have to do what Putin wants. Well, Putin would be ecstatic. As I think I've intimated, I don't think even if Trump said that, I honestly don't think the sovereign leader of a sovereign country, democratically elected, would cave. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have to make their own calculus. They maybe find a different peacemaker and different negotiator. The other problem is the Russians keep sending negotiators who are terrible, who are absolutely committed to a view that Ukraine is not a sovereign state. Their Minister of Cultures on February 4th of 2022, 3 weeks before the invasion, said Ukraine is not a sovereign state. So they have to send serious negotiators with a serious plan. For Trump, it's a PR ploy. It's already a win. He keeps people talking about him instead of talking about other things that are going on in the United States, about which there's much to say. So I think he's already got a win right there. He doesn't seem invested in the outcome. He wants whatever will enrich frankly, possibly himself. Oil fields, golf courses, cryptocurrency. I'm sorry, I can be frank, but I don't see him really concerned with the fate of 40 million people who are living outside of their country, living in difficult circumstances, or living inside their country at the front lines. There are people in the villages that are being fought over who weren't able to leave for one reason or another. There are children who've been abducted into Russia and their parents can't find them. There are, clear evidence of the torture, and the men who come back from the Russian prisons look like they came out of Auschwitz.
And with Trump, as you've just articulated, I suppose uninterested in the final result, with the two sides so far apart right now on their conditions for peace, I imagine the prospect for compromise really anytime soon is unlikely.
I think so. And it's possible that what Trump would want is swapping some Russian land, that the U.S. as he tried to make the mineral deal with Ukraine. I could imagine him trying to make a deal with Russia that he'll get, I don't know, Kuril Islands or something. But I don't think that's likely.
What might Putin be expected to surrender in that case?
He's going to try and not surrender anything. And Trump admires him. So it's very hard to imagine Trump holding Putin's feet to the fire. He will. It seems like he comes out of every meeting, as long as he's face to face with Putin, he comes out of the meeting mimicking whatever Putin has said. So, the good news is that when he talks to Zelensky and sometimes when he talks to the Europeans, he has a more balanced view. He's really thinking about what's good for the Ukrainians. But he would have to have. Somebody recently said, Mike Kaufman, who's in Washington, D.C., said the problem with the Trump administration is they claim they know what end goal they want, but they haven't paid enough attention to the process. Negotiators have to spend weeks, months sometimes, in locked door, hammer it out. This will be the front line. This is where we'll ceasefire. This is who will negotiate it. This will be the consequences for failure to do that. And that has to be really very carefully thought through with the Ukrainians at the table.
If we are to take Trump's words at face value, that, his true intention really is just to assess Putin by sitting across from him, by seeing him face to face, by hearing him one-on-one, is this then just diplomacy, or should we really be concerned about a redrawing of the geopolitical map?
I think it's, first of all, it's not real diplomacy in the sense that real diplomats actually look very closely at the actions. And when Putin steps up the volley of attacks on civilian apartment buildings, he's showing that ironically, I think he may be showing that he's ready to get to negotiating because he's trying to put as much boots on the ground as he can, as far as he can. But a diplomatic approach is to look at what are the actions of the country you're engaging in and what are the answers that they would take seriously. So I think that they are very far apart. In a scary way, Trump and Putin as individuals are kind of close. They have the similar mindset. But in terms of the interests of their countries and the interests of the war, I think they're very far apart. And if Trump thinks he's going to get a Nobel Prize out of this, I cannot ever imagine the Nobel Committee saying this is pre-swap worthy.
Should we be concerned then about, this is the beginning of a redrawing of the world powers and a reordering of the world powers?
It could be. Certainly Trump, when he first came into power, acted like he wanted a North American sphere of influence that would include Greenland and Panama, Canada. I'm sure you have very strong views about that, as do I. He wanted a North American sphere of influence, then Russia could have a European sphere of influence, and China could have a South Asian sphere of influence. I have a feeling that this time it's Trump who's in the, let's cosplay that we're saving the world. And they are definitely acting like they're thinking about spheres of influence. The Europeans, North Americans who disagree with this approach, this is completely untenable. And so far, none of Trump's dreams about the North American, update of the Monroe Doctrine or whatever, none of those are coming true. And I don't think he can enforce them. I mean, the Europeans are united on this. They are pro-Ukrainian. And the war is not going to end just because Trump says it. No. Would the two leaders make some kind of pact? Certainly, they would love to make a pact at the expense of Ukraine. They would love to make a pact at the expense of the rest of the world. It's, there's only so much real power, even though they both have very large militaries. The U.S. military is the size of the next 9 countries put together, and the Russian military is overextended as it is. I don't think Putin has much to offer Trump, but we don't know what he's planning either. Another man who keeps his cards close to his chest. So I think we should be worried, but I think as long as the Europeans and Canadian and American critical thinkers are united with the Ukrainians, behind the Ukrainians, have the Ukrainians at the table, I think that they can't do too much damage.
I'm going to leave it on that very poignant note. Professor Elizabeth Wood, really appreciate your insights today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Caryn. It was a delight.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.